Hey, welcome back. In this episode, we're going to learn about different types of source control systems, which include centralized version control and distributed version control. My name is Sushant Sutish, and I'm your trainer for this Microsoft certified Azure DevOps Engineer certification course. So, without wasting any more time, let's get into it. Let us start with understanding what is centralized version control. Centralized version control systems are based on the idea that there is a single central copy of your project somewhere, probably on a server, and programmers will check in or commit their changes to this central copy. Committing a change simply means recording the change in the central system. Other programmers can then see this change. They can also pull down the change, and the version control tool will automatically update the contents of any files that were changed. Most modern version control systems deal with change sets, which simply are a group of changes, possibly to many files, that should be treated as a cohesive whole. For example, a change to C header file and the corresponding .c file should always be kept together. Programmers no longer have to keep many copies of the files on their hard drives manually, because the version control tool can talk to central copy and retrieve any version they need on the fly. Some of the most common centralized version control systems you may have heard or used are TFVC or CVS or Subversion or SVN or Perforce. Let's look at a typical centralized version control workflow. When you're working with a centralized version control system, your workflow for adding a new feature or fixing a bug in your project will usually look something like this. Get the latest changes other people have made from their central server, make your changes and make sure they work properly, and check your changes to the central server or other programmers can see them. Now let's look at distributed version control. In the past 5 years or so, a new breed of tools has appeared, so-called distributed version control system or DVCS for short. The three most popular of these are Mercurial, GIT, and Bazaar. These systems do not necessarily rely on a central server to store all the versions of a project's files. Instead, every developer clones a copy of a repository and has the full history of the project on their own hard drive. This copy or clone has all the metadata of the original. This method may sound wasteful, but in practice, it's not a problem. Most programming projects consist mostly of plain text files and maybe few images. And this space is so cheap that storing many copies of a file doesn't create a noticeable dent in a hard drive's free space. Modern system also compresses the files to use even less space. The act of getting new changes from a repository is usually called pulling, and the act of moving your own changes to a repository is called pushing. In both cases, you move change sheets, not single file differences. One common misconception about distributed version control system is that there cannot be a central project repository. This is simply not true. There is nothing stopping you from saying this copy of the project is the authoritative one. This means that instead of a central repository being required by the tools you use, it is now optional and purely a social issue. Now let's look at the advantages over centralized version control. The act of cloning an entire repository gives distributed version control tools several advantages over centralized systems. So let me tell you all these advantages over central version control one by one. The first one is performing actions other than pushing and pulling change sets is extremely fast because the tool only needs to access the hard drive, not a remote server. Second one is committing new change sets can be done locally without anyone else seeing them. Once you have a group of change sets ready, you can push all of them at once. Another one is everything but pushing and pulling can be done without an internet connection. So you can work on a plane and you won't be forced to commit several bug fixes as a big change set. Another advantage is since each programmer has a full copy of the project repository, you can share changes with one or two other people at a time if they want to get some feedback before showing the changes to everyone. So, is there any disadvantages compared to centralized version control? There are almost no disadvantages to using a distributed version control system over a centralized one. Distributed systems do not prevent you from having a single central repository. They just provide more option on top of that. So let's look at a couple of inherent disadvantages of using a distributed systems. If your project contains many large binary files that cannot be easily compressed, the space needed to store all versions of the files can accumulate quickly. Another disadvantage could be if your project has a very long history, downloading the entire history can take an impractical amount of time and disk space. Now let us look into what is Git and TFVC. First, let's look at Git. Git is a distributed version control system. Each developer has a copy of the source repository on their dev machine, and developers can commit each set of changes on their dev machine and perform version control operations such as history and compare without a network connection. Branches are lightweight. When you need to switch context, you can create a private local branch, and you can quickly switch from one branch to another to pivot among different versions of a code base. Later, you can merge, publish, or dispose of the branch. So what is TFVC? TFVC is Team Foundation Version Control. And Team Foundation Version Control is a centralized version control system. Typically, team members have only one version of each file on their dev machines. Historical data is maintained only on the server, and branches are path-based and created on the server. And TFVC has two workflow models: server workspaces and local workspaces. So what is server workspaces? Before making changes, team members publicly check out files. Most operations require developers to be connected to the server. This system facilitates locking workflows. Other systems that work this way include Visual Source Safe, Perforce, and CVS. With server workspaces, you can scale up to very large code bases with millions of files per branch and large binary files. So what is local workspaces? Each team member takes a copy of the latest version of the code base with them and work offline as needed. Developers check in their changes and resolve conflicts as necessary. Another system that works this way is Subversion. So that concludes this episode. In the next episode, we are going to learn why Git. So I will see you in the next one. Until then, take care.